Hi, this is Gary DeWall, and this is Bridging the Week, November 4th to 8th, and today is November 11th, 2013. Good morning. The 29th Annual Futures Industry Association's Expo was held last week in Chicago, Illinois, and it was fitting that this occurred after the conclusion of the New York City Marathon on November 3rd. It seemed that, just like the runners at the finish line in New York City Central Park, participants at FIA's Expo were exhausted. And why shouldn't they be? With the likelihood that the first made available to trade determination will be made by no later than the first quarter of 2014, swap execution facilities soon will be fully up and running, and the last of the major pieces of the Title VII proposed architecture for centralized swaps clearing and execution, first envisioned in Pittsburgh by the G20 in September 2009, will be in place in the U.S. By then, the sprint to comply with most of the new CFTC regulations should be complete. However, on the landscape still remains the challenge next year of the rollout of EMIR in Europe and other central clearing initiatives in each of the other of the G20 jurisdictions. So while the runners in the New York City Marathon got to return to their homes on November 3rd and live in the glory of their accomplishments that Sunday, participants at the FIA Expo at best had a short pause in their race schedule last week. No sooner will the work be done in the U.S. than attention has to be turned to ensure compliance with EMIR in Europe and the requirements of the other G20 jurisdictions elsewhere in the world. Woof! I'm tired just thinking of this paragraph. However, in addition to the events at FIA Expo, there were many noteworthy regulatory news items last week that are covered in the article version of this week's Bridging the Week on this website. But let's look at some of the top stories here on this video version. Last week, the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission proposed new rules related to derivative speculative position limits addressing absolute levels regarding 28 so-called core reference futures contracts involving various agricultural commodities, energy products and metals, aggregation of related accounts, and what constitutes bona fide hedging positions. The proposed rules are meant to replace final rules adopted by the CFTC on October 18, 2011 that you will recall were vacated by a U.S. District Court during September 2012. Each CFTC proposed speculative limit applies to the total of a trader's futures and options and economically equivalent swaps across all trading venues and over-the-counter, to the extent that the derivatives products are under the jurisdiction of the CFTC. They do not apply to financial instruments under the jurisdiction of the SEC. Ultimately, the Commission will expand the list of core reference futures contracts in physical commodities. Spot limits generally are proposed to be set at 25% of estimated deliverable supply and be applied separately to physical delivery and cash-settled reference contracts. Non-spot month limits generally are proposed to be set as a function of open interest using the so-called 10-2.5 formula, meaning 10% of a contract's first 25,000 of open interest plus 2.5% of the remainder. There will be single month and all months combined limits. There will be exemptions from speculative position limits solely for bona fide hedging positions. In general, all bona fide hedge positions must be to offset price risk, quote, incidental to commercial cash operations, end of quote, and must be acquired and liquidated in, quote, an orderly manner in accordance with sound commercial practices, end of quote. The proposed rules also address aggregation requirements for affiliated entities but permit exemptions under certain circumstances. Comments will be due on the new proposed rules by 60 days after their publication in the Federal Register. I have a much more comprehensive summary of these new proposed rules on my website. Check it out. Last week, the CFTC brought 3 enforcement actions on diverse themes, one related to customer protection, one related to alleged manipulation, and the third related to alleged speculative limit violations. First, the saga of AlphaMetrix continues. Following the member responsibility action filed by the National Futures Association on October 21st, the CFTC on November 4th also filed an enforcement action against AlphaMetrix in the U.S. District Court in Chicago, claiming that the firm misappropriated over $2.8 million of funds belonging to its various commodity pools. And it claims that the firm hid its fraud by issuing false account statements to pool investors. Specifically, pursuant to various side letters between AlphaMetrix and pool participants, the firm was required to reinvest certain fees otherwise owed to pool participants in the pools. Instead, the firm transferred the fees to the parent company of the firm, which allegedly was experiencing financial difficulty. Separately, AlphaMetrix consented to a CFTC-requested order requiring it to return at least 95% of all its operated funds assets to its customers within 15 days of the formal entry of the court order, as well as other prophylactic relief. Separately, on November 6, perhaps time for the opening of FI Expo? Who knows? You decide. The CFTC commenced an enforcement action against DRW Investments and its principal, Don Wilson, in New York for the alleged manipulation of the settlement price of the IDEX, or the IDEX US dollar 3-month interest rate swap futures contract listed on NASDAQ's OMX Futures Exchange and cleared by the International Derivatives Clearinghouse. According to the Commission, DRW established a long position in the 3-month contracts beginning in August 2010. Afterwards, beginning in December 2010, the respondents placed bids, quote, that DRW knew would never be accepted, quote, artificially to influence the settlement prices in their favor during the 15-minute period that most influenced settlement prices on at least 118 trading days in a, quote, banging the close, end of quote, type scheme. Previously, on September 21st, the respondents had filed a lawsuit against the CFTC in Chicago seeking to prohibit the CFTC to file an enforcement action against them. In that prior action, the respondents mostly acknowledged the facts alleged by the CFTC in its current enforcement action. However, the respondents argued that IDCH had no obligation in its rules to reference DRW's orders to calculate settlement prices, but instead, its orders reflected DRW's analysis of what it perceived to be a flawed contract, mainly the 3-month contract was not economically equivalent to a comparable uncleared 3-month swap, were orders it was willing to execute, and were posted for sufficient time for an execution to occur. And finally, on November 5th, the CFTC filed an enforcement action naming James Yadgir for violating speculative position limits of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange in connection with his trading of live cattle futures contracts in April 2011 and feeder cattle futures contracts during May 2012. In the complaint, the CFTC alleges that Yadgir violated the live cattle spot limit on one day on April 6, 2011 through positions in 2 accounts. He reduced his positions on April 7th and was issued a warning letter by the CME on September 19th. He is alleged to have violated the spot limit for feeder cattle on 2 days, May 23rd and 24th, 2012, including on the 2nd day by 0.152 of one contract. Let me repeat that. 0.152 of one contract. I thought I heard the CFTC was lacking sufficient resources these days. And briefly, SG America Securities Inc. was fined $675,000 US, and TD Ameritrade Clearing was fined $1.15 million US related to their failure to report or accurately report various large option positions, as well as for not having adequate supervisory oversight. SG America's large options position reporting violations occurred during various intervals from December 2007 through January 2013, while TD Ameritrade's violations happened from May 2007 through May 2013. In order to retain its status as a so-called qualified central counterparty, ICE Clear US will increase the size of its guarantee fund from $300 million US to $450 million US as of January 1st, 2014, to cover the potential default of 2 clearing members with the largest aggregate credit exposure in extreme but plausible market conditions. This will require an increase in the amount funded by clearing members to $400 million US, as ICE will cover $50 million US by itself. Also, as of January 1st, clearing members can no longer post money market mutual funds to satisfy their original margin or guarantee fund requirements. Previously, you recall, ICE announced that as of the new year, at least 50% of a member's guarantee fund requirement must be posted in cash. The Singapore Exchange Derivatives Clearing Limited also proposed changes to the waterfall related to its clearing fund structure and its procedures for managing the default of a member who clears over-the-counter financial derivatives. These are pretty tricky and tough to describe in short video segment, but I explain them on the written version of Bridging the Week on my website. Check it out. And finally, as widely reported, various SAC capital management companies pled guilty last week to charges of securities and wire fraud in connection with various allegations of insider trading by various employees from 1999 through at least 2010. The allegations relate to trading in securities of more than 20 public companies. As part of its pleas, the SAC companies agreed to pay a fine of $1.184 billion in addition to $616 million previously paid to the SEC in connection with similar civil charges. The terms of the settlement are subject to approval by the U.S. District Court. Well, that's a lot, as usual. This is Gary DeWaal, and until next week, this is Bridging the Week. Have a great week. Ciao.